Hello, everybody, and thank you for inviting me to do this talk. It's always very exciting to talk about my work to people who are interested or students of architecture. Talk to people that are interested in architecture because my work has over the years focused a lot on architecture, and so I'm particularly happy to share that and to share with people in Johannesburg. I've not yet done, since we're on this COVID thing, I've not yet done a talk in South Africa. So and my work is almost all about South Africa, or at least Southern Africa. Mozambique comes in a lot as well. So it's particularly nice to do that. Could I just ask Ruth or Huda, one of you, to give me like a 5-minute warning, 5 minutes before you want me to stop talking, if you want me to take questions and so on. So you work it out. I've organized far too many slides. And I'm happy to reorganize if you give me a 5-minute warning, and then I'll just round it all up. Is that okay? Could you do that?
Sure. So I'll let you know when it's around 11:45 and you can...
Yeah, perfect. Okay, so let me just, by way of introduction, start giving you a little bit of my... I started working in the late 80s and early 90s in South Africa. I was a very quick biographic input here. I grew up a colonial child in Mozambique, and I lived in South Africa, studied in South Africa, went to Michaelis, and so had a pretty toxic formal education, both undergraduate and I did a master's at Michaelis as well, and postgraduate. And I finished art school at the beginning of the 80s. And when I came out of art school, I realized that I was deficient in my education as far as my African context was concerned. And then I embarked on a kind of personal, informal education by connecting people in Cape Town, young artists of my own age, mostly through something which was then called CAP, the Community Arts Project. And my contemporaries at the time would have been people like Billy Mandindi, who's passed away, David Hlungwane, who's made a career for himself, but mostly in Cape Town, and people like Mashek Walanga, who have gone on to carve themselves a fairly international career. So that sort of positions you a little bit, gives you an idea of where I can situate myself within my ideas, my thinking, and my processes. So when I came out of art school, amongst these new friends that I'd made, and with an incredible fast learning curve, I realized that I couldn't just make art that was abstract and abstracted from the context of South Africa. In the 80s, South Africa was burning. So I very quickly realized that I'd had a formal education with a particularly strong conceptual input, that I loved that conceptual input, but that I was also fiercely committed to make it be relevant in the place where I lived in Africa. And then at that time, it was Cape Town. I know very little about Joburg still today. And so my practice started with a drive to kind of connect conceptualism and my kind of sense of being African and making work that was pertinent in Africa. And then in that pursuit, I also realized that I needed to make work about things that were popular, i.e. that were connectable to anybody and everybody in South Africa. And I realized that my sources of references, if I was going to do that, should be situated somewhere in the area of popular culture. But that popular culture was pretty divisive in South Africa at the time. And so I needed to choose something within popular culture that was applicable to all in South Africa. And that was a particularly tough time of exploration and choosing. And I eventually, by a set of coincidences as well, but I eventually started becoming interested in architecture And I quickly realized that architecture was a very amazingly complex, popular reference. And I'll unpack that a little bit so that it makes a bit of sense. What I wanted was something that was rooted in the ground, so rooted in soil. And this idea of rootedness in soil still comes through my work today in very different ways, but it still comes through. And I was looking at architecture as a potential political statement, because of course architecture in South Africa is political. As it turns out, through the years I've learned architecture is just political everywhere. But not only that, it was also sociological and anthropological, because people lived in it, and the way people lived in it made a big difference, and people related to it. And there was an incredible thing about architecture, which was also the fact that everybody had access to it. So, and I don't mean in the way of, oh, am I a rich person? Can I build a fancy house? I wasn't interested in that at all. What I was interested in was the fact that a building is something that exists, and you and I and everybody goes past the same buildings. And we all know these buildings, whether we relate to them, whether they symbolize good things for us or bad things, it doesn't matter. They're there, they're recognizable, and they're accessible. So if we all live in the same city and we mention the Cape Town City Hall, for example, nobody's going to question, most people are not going to question, well, what's the Cape Town City Hall? Just because it is a marking object in the city we all live in. Some of us have been in it, some of us haven't, but we all kind of know where it is and what it is. So that architecture became to me the kind of language that I could use as a starting point for projects that would mean that people had access to the project, and I could work in a conceptual way based on something that was very accessible. So that's how I started looking at architecture. And then what also happened is along the years, I was very influenced by odd events. Like, for example, I should say, and I should give credit to, there was a book that David Goldblatt published very early on in his life, which was called Structures. And Structures was an incredibly interesting book because Goldblatt was photographing basically, I haven't looked at the book in many years, so I'm kind of, this is off the cuff, but basically he was photographing houses in the countryside in South Africa, mostly Afrikaans, white houses, houses of white people, a lot of them in the countryside. So there was a particular trace to the houses. And what was interesting about the photographs, and I don't know how David Goldblatt did it, but what I learned from those photographs is that you could look at those photographs and somehow he had imbued the photograph with transmitting to me the idea of fascism and oppression and apartheid. There was something imposing about the buildings themselves and the language that the building was built with and the ideologies that they represented. And over the years, looking at those buildings, I realized that actually you could look at a building and you could read information from a building. Most of us don't do that because we're just walking around our normal lives and buildings are just things that are there. But if you stop and you look at each building and you start looking at what year it was built in, what kind of formal qualities does it have, what kind of people does it serve, what is its history, what materials it was built in, you can read an enormous amount about the place that the building is built in, the political system that it's in, it comes from, the way people live around it, you know, things like defense mechanisms of a building tell you an enormous amount about the context that those buildings are imposed in. Anyway, so reading buildings has been the kind of language that I've developed over the years. And of course, like anything else, as you go along, you know, like you get better and better at it, you get more trained, and one information feeds the next, and so on. So to get started here, I'll give you more kind of biographical input as we go along. I just put this image here because this is an image of a building that you will know. This is JAG being built in 1909 or 1910. And I was particularly inspired by this photograph, which I'll talk to you about a little bit later, because it's the facade of JAG. It's this neoclassical, pretentious, European, highfalutin architectural language, which is so ironical in the context of South Africa and becomes ever more ironical. I don't think there's any redemption for this. But the problem here was that, or what I liked was the fact that it was unfinished, incomplete, still scaffolded, so it was sort of gridded around it. There was something evocative, but more about that later. So that you don't think, you start understanding what I mean about architecture, we'll go to my first project. And I'm sorry to start so early in my life, and it's a long practice, 30 years. So this is Khayelitsha in Cape Town in 1991. And this is a program that started Khayelitsha, that the government, the then apartheid government, still built it in the idea, it was called Sites and Services. It was an urban project run by the City Council of Cape Town, which was meant to provide people with a toilet. So each of these little houses are toilets. I don't have to unpack. Sorry, you'll forgive me sometimes if I give useless information, so I don't always talk to South African audiences. But anyway, these are the industrially built multiple toilets that each family would receive and be allowed to build informal housing around here. And what you see of Khayelitsha today started here. Now, so to go back to my very origins, I was interested in conceptual art. At the time, something called land art was a big influence in my own education. So when I looked at these prepared sites from Sites and Services in Khayelitsha, for me, this had a double meaning. It was all about the impositions of apartheid, and they were harsh, these camps, in that they were almost concentration camp-like, the images that resulted from documenting these structures. But they were also a relief of life somehow. People would get a road, people would get this hideous communal lighting, and these toilets, which they could use. So there was sewerage prepared. So I kind of saw these images as both a conceptual art statement and a political statement about South Africa. And this is the first project that I ever did where I felt as an artist I had traction. And that's why I'm showing it to you today. So I'll give you a bit more of, so you don't really recognize Khayelitsha today, but that's Khayelitsha. And to position you, for those of you who've been to Cape Town, you can see the mountain is right at the end. You're driving on the N2 sort of thing. And then the details, the architectural details of these structures were incredibly inspiring from a sculptural point of view and from a conceptual and political point of view, because of course each of these structures had numbers at the back that were incredibly reminiscent of the kind of numbering that went on, for example, in the concentration camps during the Holocaust. And so I started getting interested in the sculptural cement elements, the PVC piping that was used in the sewerage and so on. So to give you some details of what I was looking at. And again, remember, from potential sculptural inspiration and a political inspiration. So here are some of the sculptures. I made 6 sculptures, 2 of them stayed in South Africa. This is one of them. And so this would be metal shelving, which, I mean, I work in a very free way. So there's a lot of poetic license. And these are PVC pipes up there. Can you see my cursor? These are PVC pipes. This would be a cement surface here. But then there were 4 of these sculptures, which I was particularly keen on keeping together. And here they are together. So here you can start seeing more clearly that this is very close and reminiscent to what you were seeing in the photographs of the sites and services in Khayelitsha. And at the time, I actually managed to steal some cement blocks from the sites where they were still building. So these cements, this work is in a collection in Lisbon now, and it always makes me, always amuses me that the cement blocks from building toilets in Khayelitsha are now in an art collection in Lisbon, but that's how life works, because that's where I live at the moment. And I also thought I would include these photographs because these were actually photographed at my show at JAG. And I know from Ruth that you, or some of you, have been to JAG, so you know the gallery, and I had a show there in 2017, which was called South Facing, and this was photographed in that space. Okay, so to continue a little bit more on how I was looking at, how I'm looking at architecture and how I kind of unpack it in a political and artistic way, I'd like to start looking, this will be a quick, we'll just go through this quickly, but so this is how this sort of middle class house here, it's actually this house here is where I was born in Mozambique. So it's actually 2 houses, they kind of like townhouses tucked together. So as I started thinking about all these issues, I started reminiscing about modernist architecture in Africa. And I started reminiscing about that particularly because, as I said, I'm Mozambican born from 3rd generation Mozambican parents and Joburg grandparents, great-grandparents, and I was always amazed at how Maputo is full of incredible modernist architecture. And I could, as I started learning about the history of architecture and the history of art, I was always bamboozled by how this kind of modernist language, you know, this sort of like Rietveld sort of look architecture appeared in the east coast of Africa in what was, you know, in 1958 or 59, like the arse end of the world, by the kind of reigning importances of Europe and America. Maputo was really a lost city. And I started kind of doing quite a bit of investigation about how does modernism arrive in Africa. And of course, like all of you, I'm sure I quickly realized that modernism was very much, in architecture, was very much part of an international style. The project of international architecture in modernism was very much part of its ethos. So the modernists were very intent on spreading it. And I also realized that the architects who were working in Mozambique at the time were closely involved with their Dutch counterparts, and of course, as I said, Rietveld, etc. Holland is very much one of the hearts of this modernist architectural language, still is today. We still go to Holland to visit all these houses with their little covers over our shoes. But I was still pretty enthralled by trying to understand the role of modernism in Africa, and I thought, well, I'll start by my own house. There's nothing wrong with your own place. And I started looking into how the world gets represented by map making, map projections. So I quickly realized that there's no map projection that is able to represent the world, because for a simple reason, and I'm sure those of you who actually draw know that as well as I do, that if you have something which is a ball that is round, it's almost impossible to represent on a flat piece of paper, because somewhere along the line you're going to be lying. Either you're lying when you're representing the equator, or you're lying when you're representing the poles. It's almost impossible to represent. So there's no such thing as a map that is absolutely reliable in terms of its representation. Everything that we have as an image of the Earth, except for what is photographed from the spatial trips that we all know so well, is actually a lie. But I do find that map makers work with projections, and there are many projections. Some distort some areas more and other areas less, and so on. So I decided to make a series of works whereby I would document the house that you saw in video, and the documentation is a little bit like my eye looking at it, so it moves a little bit on the screen and it winks every now and again. But the actual screen is built in the form of the three-dimensional projections of the map. So when you project an image of the house onto a deformed screen, you actually get a deformed representation of the house. So this is the picture of the house when it was built, when I was born, and this was the picture of the house with all its trees and burglar bars and so on, and big gates in the front when I made the project in 1999. The house does not belong to my parents or my family anymore, so I'm always photographing it from the outside. I don't have access to it. And this is what the installation looks like. So what you get are these two projections that are real projections, because you're actually projecting video material onto it, and each one deforms the house in a very different way. So, you know, there's an attempt here to allude also to an historical development. You know, the house was made in colonial times, and by 1999, I'm photographing it, obviously, you know, almost 25 years after independence in Maputo. Time lapses and political lapse have also created distortions, if one can look at it that way. So I'm looking at the idea of map distortions as a political metaphor, and doing that always through the image of the house. Okay, so let's go on to, I stupidly didn't bring a watch. I'd like to keep that. Let's go on to, we're jumping a lot of times, so it's long practice, so we have to jump. Maison Tropicale, which is probably one of my more in-depth projects and one of the more enjoyable projects that I did. That was in 2007, and Maison Tropicale literally means tropical house. It has a French name because it was designed by a French architect called Jean Prouvé, another modernist who designed in France for Africa without ever having visited Africa, enthralled by the colonial project and roped into it by the sort of late investments that the French government operated after the Second World War. South Africa never really experienced it, but a lot of the other African countries, particularly the Lusophone countries and the Francophone countries, after the Second World War, the colonial governments got really desperate and thought, oh boy, the winds of change are blowing and we could lose independence, we could lose these colonies. And so one way to avoid, or at least to delay the loss of the colonies, would be to invest in infrastructure. So they invested a lot in architecture. And Maison Tropicale was one of those investments where the French government at the end of the 1940s decided to experiment with building houses in aluminium, which were going to be implanted in Niger and Congo, the French Congo. There are two Congos, the DRC and Brazzaville. This was in the French Congo. And so Jean Prouvé, who was an extraordinary modernist designer, designed this house, which was a prefab house in aluminium. and they attempted to transport it to Africa. They were going to build 10,000 units of this house. I show you the photograph here of how I actually found the house. This was shown at an architectural school in LA, and the students were actually rebuilding the house. And I was just curious because of its name, you know, Maison Tropicale. It's such an incredible name. And then started doing some research. And then I found Prouvé, the architect. And for those of you who have not heard of Prouvé, I strongly recommend you should look into him. He is an exemplary modernist designer, and actually a fairly democratic designer. It just so happens he got involved and roped into the colonial project. I'm just showing you these. Sorry for the bad slides. These are just taken offline. These are just example of objects that he's designed. And in the late 1900s, so just before the century started and our century started, his work was kind of rediscovered and became incredibly pricey. And this is like an exhibition of his works at a fancy gallery. But to go back to Maison Tropicale, so they built 3 prototypes of this prefab house, and they shipped it to Niger, in Niamey, in Niger, and to Brazzaville. And so here you see one of my favorite photographs where they're kind of packing the house into these airplanes that look like they were like war airplanes, just kind of repainted. Cargo airplanes, and they're shipping the components of the house. And they installed and built these houses. The one was built in Niamey, and here it is, brand new and built. It was planted on a cement platform that Prouvé himself, without ever visiting Niamey, designed, and it had tiles on the floor. And it had these incredible structures of brise soleil. In fact, Prouvé is known to be the inventor of the brise soleil, which is kind of a common architectural feature. He was very interested in keeping the heat out of houses and structures. So the houses have this extra skin that can open and close according to where the wind's blowing from. They are quite extraordinary even by 1949 standards, and very, very advanced and spaceship-like. And here is an incredible view of, in the middle of the house, there's this courtyard and one of the Prouvé chairs that came also in the container. And at the end there you can see the Niger, the famous river. And these photographs, these were taken at the time when the house was built, and this was taken in the early 2000s. So it shows you the house is still in pretty good condition. And of course, this is desert, so the transport of goods is all made with camels. The houses hadn't had much upkeep, but they were still standing and looking in pretty good order. I mean, you can see they hardly had a coat of paint. It's still the original paint. Then there were 2 other models. The photographs here are 2 other prototypes. The photographs here are less sharp, but there's one here, one structure here, and another structure here. This is now in Brazzaville. Now we are in the equator, and so the ground is much damper, much fuller of mosquitoes. And so Prouvé decided to design the set of, again, very modernistic, standard idea, a set of pilotis whereby the houses would be elevated off the ground and therefore away from the damp, the mosquitoes, the insects, and so on. So the structures on top are exactly the same as what we saw in Niamey, but they're different. And here is a photograph of the houses again in the early 2000s. I was curious, see there's a little bridge here that joins the houses one with the other. Again, there are a few pieces missing, but for 50 years, it's not bad the way they've lasted. Of course, the pilotis have been closed in to make room for other accommodation. The Congo went through an incredibly devastating set of civil wars, and so the country was pretty ravaged. And so none of this is my work, this is all the story, but the story got interesting for me when I realized that in 2003, a collector from Paris, supposedly discovered these houses and went to these two places and unpacked them, unconstructed them, deconstructed them, and packed them into containers again, and literally stole them out of Africa, brought them to Europe, restored them, and was busy selling them by the time I did the project in 2007. So here you have the image of our emissary. I don't know if this is actually the collector or just a worker that's come from Paris. And these are the Nigerians, the Niger people packing the house into the container. I also found, I was pretty shocked by this, and that's when I realized, when I realized that there'd been a whole colonial project, and then there was a whole neo-colonial project where the houses had been taken away once Prouvé had become such a famous and desirable producer of things. Then I realized there was a project for me, and I went and started doing some serious research, and I found these amazing drawings of Prouvé's assistant, a man called Banil, who had planned how the house components could be packed into the container. And it was a very difficult project for me because I on the one hand, really admire Jean Prouvé. I think he was an extraordinary designer and love his work. But at the same time, I was incredibly critical of the whole history of the house and what it symbolized. And we were in 2007, and the houses were then they had been renovated, and they're now being sold on the art market by Christie's and other fashionable auction houses. And when I should have disconnected this. When I found this picture, so I knew I had to represent the house somehow, but I knew I had to do it critically, and I didn't want to disrespect Prouvé's design qualities, but it was for me a very political issue, and I wanted to. So I had this, which I don't need to explain, next to my wall, next to this in my studio all the time. And I knew that the connection was between the way the house was unpacked and carried to Africa and carried from Africa back to Europe, and the way slaves were packed and carried out of Africa. And so I started devising, I went to see the house. I wanted to show you the restored house on sale in Paris, just next to the Seine. Of course, my theory is that it looks more sophisticated with a newly renovated technology than it did when it was built. That's the house presented in New York when it was sold in 2007, it was sold for $7 million. So just go back to I had also found this incredible image of the platforms in Niamey when the house was built, and I liked them very much because they reminded me of Donald Judd's cement structures in looking at minimalist sculpture. So I was very enthralled with these images, and I quickly devised my sculpture from the idea of the container to the idea of packing the house. I was lucky that he designed the house in components. This is a prefab project. So I could stick to the same components that he designed. I started making maquettes of how I could pack all my sculptural objects of the house into a container, and that's not important. That's the place where I showed it, and that's so what I ended up building was a sculptural container that was open, which contained the pieces. You walked into the exhibition, you never saw the full size of the container. It was hidden behind the wall on the left here. You had to walk through the container, and that made me particularly happy because I could see that people were in the house, even though the house wasn't itself anymore. The house was now in a permanent state of being packed away and moved. And this idea of the house having been removed from its locale of its existence, from its roots, and being in a permanent state of movement was, to me, the kind of metaphoric statement. So there you can see what it looks like. So you'd have to walk through that. And as you walked through it, you realize there were photographs on the wall. So what happened was that when I was constructing the container part of the sculpture, I realized the project wasn't complete, even though it was a 10-meter long sculpture. It was huge. And I realized that the reason why it wasn't complete is because I'd had those platforms in my mind, those cement platforms and those pilotis in my mind. And I kept thinking, well, they stole the houses to sell them in Europe, but they couldn't have stolen the cement. So I proposed to the curator that we find somebody to do research, and we did that, and we found the cement structures in their places in Africa. And we then found a little bit of extra money, and we traveled to the both sites, and we documented the remnants of the house, the places where they'd been implanted, where for me it was like going to the cemeteries of the house in a way. So when you walked into the container and through the container, you I'll never get through this. You saw the photographs of I'll show you the pictures quickly. So this is what the container then looks like from inside the space. This is the object without being stuck in the wall, to give you an idea of its scale. And these are the actual photographs of what the remnants I found of the Prouvé houses. This is in Brazzaville. This is also in Brazzaville. Again, Brazzaville. Here we are, the closed surfaces that we saw earlier on. And this is in Niamey. This was altogether the more evocative space. Okay, so it's very short time. I see it's already 43. I need to go to maybe a more recent project. So to not leave you with, I was going to show you my project at JAG or the Miriam Makeba project. I'll go for Miriam Makeba, and then we can, if we feel we have time. So in 2019, we now last year, and my work still, not all my work is around architecture. I've now kind of branched off to a few other things. Also because talking about the history of Africa and the transition between colonialism and post-colonial independent states can often be incredibly heavy, and the stories can be quite harsh to deal with. So one of my other series of works has been, I've done a whole series of work on Mozambique, which I've not shown you anything of, but I've also done a series of works that are about looking at role models, African role models of people that I admire, and thinking of role models that I needed growing up, and giving credit to these people. So, and usually I work with towers. They're usually structures, towers which transmit information, either songs or poetry or something like. So I've done one for Ingrid Jonker. I've done one for Peter Blom, who's an fairly unknown Afrikaans rebellious poet. I did a project for a Mozambican journalist called Carlos Cardoso. I did a project for Jimi Hendrix. I did a project for Jorge Benjor, who sings a song about Zumbi, who was the slave hero in Brazil. And a lot of them don't have too much architecture in them, except this last one that I did is on Miriam Makeba, and it's called Dalaba Sol d'Exil. And I'll explain. Dalaba Sol, Dalaba is the name of a town in Conakry, and Sol d'Exil is French for earth of exile or ground of exile. So I'm not sure how much you know about Makeba, but I'm going to play you a minute or two of a song. I wonder if you, oh, where's it gone? Can you hear? No? Yeah? No?
No.
the white men first came here from over the seas, he looked at it, said, this is God's own country. He was mighty well pleased with this land that he found, and he said, I will make him my own piece of ground. Now many's the battle he still had to fight, and many's the family who died in the night, as many's the black men who lived all around, all of them wanting their own piece of ground. Now this.
Okay, I had to just take you off my speaker there you're from. So you could hear a little bit of that, right? So I connected, that's one of Makeba's first songs called A Piece of Ground, written by a guy called Jeremy Taylor. And I, oh no, wait, hold on. Okay, I connected that and the discovery for me of this extraordinary building, which was the house that Miriam Makeba built in Conakry, in a small town north of the city of Conakry, called Dalaba, and where she lived in exile between 1968 and 1986. So I don't want to bore anybody with the history of Miriam Makeba, but basically Makeba was left without a passport on one of her travels outside South Africa in the 60s, or 60s, yeah. After she participated in a film called Maibuya Africa, and she was then without a passport, and she landed up in New York, where she started her singing career and was going quite well, but then she fell in love with Stokely Carmichael, who was an eminent member of the Black Panther Party, and they both started being persecuted in the United States, and they were then desperate to get out of the United States. She couldn't come back to South Africa, obviously, and he was American. And Sékou Touré, who was the first president of independent Guinea-Conakry, was building a very interesting cultural milieu in Conakry. And he generously invited the couple to come and live in Conakry. And he said, choose a place and I'll build you a house and you can run your careers from here, live here. And so she had a little bar in Conakry, but then built this house in Dalaba. And she claimed she built it here because the house, the view in the landscape in Dalaba reminded her a lot of the landscape around Johannesburg. So to me, I mean, being a person who's been estranged from my own country for a while, having roots and houses and being interested in how houses represent roots, I was amazed at how she built this house and developed her career in Africa, in another country in Africa. And so I didn't travel to Conakry, but I connected a photographer in Conakry who traveled and photographed the house extensively for me, and then did a project on the house. And I wanted to do a project that was both a homage, in the line of the homages to people that I consider to be role models, but also to be an architectural a form of using architecture as a discursive, critical approach to object making. So I looked at the house in what could be the important elements, formal elements of the house. And this entrance porch was a very important part of the house. A balcony, which starts at the back there, was a very important part of the house for her. This amazing roof of this rondavel was an important, very important part of the house. So I started looking at these, I kind of separated them as elements sculpturally. I'll show you a few details of the house inside as well, because I imagine those of you who don't know the house might be curious. I was. So this would have been a Conakry, a very typical Conakry way of doing the ceiling. And this would have been the floor. And that was the balcony that I spoke to you about, where she writes, she spent a lot of time, her and her family. She lived here for 15 years, and in the end she left, and she was quite scared of Secretary, became quite a dictator, but she had a life here. These are still, believe it or not, she left here in 1986. These are still some of the furniture that she used. Okay, this is a detail which I'll explain to you later. This is the back of the cable car in Table Mountain. I like the cement structure with the cables that you'll see now. So I made an exhibition which was developed in a variety of spaces that all had small doors linking them. So my first sculpture is the anchor of the Table Mountain cable car. And it has a steel cable. And what I did is I painted on the wall the image of how she painted on the walls in her house. And then I took each one of the elements that I had isolated, so in this case it's that entrance porch, and hung it as if it was being transported by a crane into a cargo ship or out of a cargo ship. If you know what a crane, they have these beautiful hanging systems with round things, and that they hook the metal parts of the crane, then hook onto whatever they're carrying. Most cases it would be a container. So I devised these as sculptural elements to hang the parts of the houses. So once again, the architectural components of the Conakry house, in Makeba's case, are never objects on the floor. They're derooted. They're always hanging from the ceiling. And in this case, the ceiling of the gallery was actually, this is a false ceiling. So I just said, oh, it doesn't matter. Make a hole in that and go to the cement in the actual building. So the sculpture actually hangs from the real building and not the fake art building, if you know what I mean. That's another one. So that's the sculpture that's based on the balcony. And then that's that first room. And then there is this steel cable that runs from one room to the other. So if you carry on there, you'll be in the room where the sculpture's hanging. And you can see there's another steel cable here that goes to the right to this one, because you can see the steel cables coming from there. So the object that looks like the Cape Town cable car holder is actually metaphorically holding my old project. I'm not sure that the photographs help you understand that, but there was another showing of this work, which I'll show you a few images of, so that I think makes a little bit more sense. Although the space is very ostentatious. So in this other showing in Oporto, I actually used the image of the house on the wall. And then we built this complex structure to hang the crane part of the object. Here you see another version of it. And then here you can actually see how the cement holder, the Cape Town holder, is here on the floor with its cables, but the cables continue to run through the spaces and eventually join all the sculptures. Here you can see here's one cable and here's another one coming. And here's just this detail. And then for this show, I also did a component, which was the roof. I want to show you all, because this project I haven't made yet. I'm just working on, but it brings me back to Khayelitsha, and it brings me back to the toilets. So when I did the Cape Town, the project's going to be called, it will be only next year, and it's called #Bucket System Must Fall. And it arose out of, actually Sean O'Toole, after my Joburg show, wrote an interesting piece on the show in which he reminded me that the issues of toilets and shit being a way to protest in South Africa, and the fact that toilets had been in my work since 1992 made me go back to this image, which was, as you all know, Roads Must Fall, and made me go back to this incredible object, which is this crane that I'd been already referencing in an odd way in the Miriam Makeba project. And now this hanging road sculpture from it. And I started seeing this all as a potential sculptural project. So here I'm researching a bucket system. And we all know that before this happened, the students were led in such desperation to the point where they brought some of what comes out of this bucket system and poured over the Rhodes sculpture at UCT. And I'm a UCT graduate, so it's kind of become part of my history as well. And so I went back to a toilet another toilet. I designed a lot of these toilets at the time. I documented and drew a lot of them. So I went back to one of those, one of my favorite ones, which is like one that you can walk in and walk around into. And I started drawing this as a sculpture. And I'm now planning a show in 2021, which will be developed from these 3 drawings. It's the only thing I have at the moment to show you. So I always like to show a work that I haven't made yet and that is still on the drawing board, so to speak. And so it will no doubt have documentation of the events at the Roads Must Fall in Cape Town, and then sculptural elements that will bring in the idea of the crane and carrying bucket system toilets and so on. That's it.